December 24th, 1944. Bastogne lay buried beneath a white silence broken only by the distant thud of artillery. Inside a dim basement-turned field hospital, candles flickered against stone walls blackened by smoke. The air smelled of blood, ether, and winter. Dozens of wounded men lay on stretchers, wrapped in blankets stiff with frost. Their lips were blue, their veins empty. The medic moved among them with shaking hands, searching for one last bottle of plasma. The crate was bare. Supplies had stopped coming days ago. Outside, the siege held tight. Snow drifted through broken windows, settling on bandages. He stared at a dying soldier and knew that waiting for help meant death. From a shelf he gathered salt, water, and sugar. He mixed them in a metal pan over a candle flame, whispering calculations under his breath. When the first drop entered a soldier's arm, he prayed the gamble would hold. To understand what drove him to that moment, we must return to the storm that engulfed the Ardennes. The winter of 1944 came down hard across Europe. Snow blanketed the forests of the Ardennes, turning once quiet villages into frozen tombs. For many Allied soldiers, it was supposed to be a time of rest and recovery after months of relentless fighting in France. They believed the war was nearly over, but on December 16, 1944, the stillness of the Ardennes was shattered. At dawn, German artillery opened fire along a 70-mile front, unleashing the last great offensive of the Third Reich. The ground shook under the weight of 1,600 guns. From the mist and pine forests, tanks bearing the Black Cross of the Wehrmacht rolled forward, and tens of thousands of German soldiers surged westward. Hitler called it Wacht am Rhein, watch on the Rhine. His goal was simple and desperate: to split the Allied lines, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into a separate peace. It was his last gamble to turn the tide of the war. For the men of the United States Army, it came as a thunderclap. Many units stationed in the Ardennes were thinly spread and unprepared. The calm sector had been considered safe. Young, inexperienced troops, clerks, cooks, and supply men suddenly found themselves face to face with seasoned German panzer divisions. Among the key towns caught in the storm was Bastogne, a crossroads city deep in Belgium. 7 vital roads converged there, making it the heart of the German advance. If Bastogne fell, the entire southern front of the Allied line would collapse. Defending it were roughly 10,000 men of the 101st Airborne Division and a handful of armored units, led by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. They were surrounded within days. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Snow clogged the roads. German artillery shelled the town day and night. Food ran low, ammunition ran lower, and the skies remained sealed by dense clouds, grounding Allied aircraft. For the wounded, it was hell without end. The division's medical teams had set up aid stations in basements, barns, and half-destroyed buildings. They worked by candlelight and with what little they had. Ambulances couldn't get through. Evacuation was impossible. Every shell that fell outside sent a fresh wave of casualties through the doors. Some came in carried on doors or stretchers made from bed frames. Others crawled in on their own. Inside these makeshift hospitals, the air was heavy with the smell of antiseptic, blood, and wood smoke. Doctors and medics worked in layers of frozen uniforms, their breath visible in the air. Metal instruments froze to their fingers. The wounded lay in long rows, some shivering, others silent. The supply crates had been packed for a brief campaign, not a siege. Within a week, morphine ran low. Bandages were washed and reused. Bottles of blood plasma, the lifeline for shock and blood loss, began to vanish one by one. Blood was everything. It kept a man alive after shrapnel or bullet tore through him. Without it, even a minor wound could become fatal in hours. The Army's answer to this had been dried plasma, a powder that could be reconstituted with sterile water. It was revolutionary in 1944, saving thousands in Normandy and beyond. But in Bastogne, under siege and without resupply, it ran out. The medics tried to stretch it. Half doses, diluted mixtures, but nothing could replace what was gone. Outside, the Germans tightened their ring. Tanks prowled the outskirts, cutting off all escape. On December 22nd, a German officer arrived under a white flag demanding surrender. McAuliffe's answer was a single word: nuts. The message was defiant, but inside the aid stations, the mood was different. The medics were losing men faster than they could save them. Some prayed, others cursed, but all kept working. They wrote blood types on men's foreheads in pencil. They patched, sewed, and hoped. One of those medics, a man who had trained for peace rather than war, found himself standing before an empty plasma crate. The last ampule had gone into a soldier only hours before. Now dozens more waited, pale and gasping. Outside, the snow fell thicker. The siege was entering its second week, and the skies showed no sign of clearing. Somewhere beyond the frozen woods, Patton's Third Army was trying to break through, but no one inside Bastogne knew if rescue would come in time. In that silence, between the thunder of artillery, one man began to think not as a soldier, but as a scientist. Somewhere in his training, he remembered the chemistry of blood, the balance of salt, water, and sugar that kept cells alive. It wasn't enough to replace blood, but perhaps it could buy time. Perhaps it could keep a heart beating just a little longer. In the frozen cellars of Bastogne, the medics faced a truth that no textbook had prepared them for. War stripped medicine to its core. Without plasma, without heat, without hope of evacuation, everything they had been taught about sterile procedures and proper supplies became irrelevant. They were left with instinct, courage, and whatever fragments of knowledge could be turned into action. The men around them were not numbers on a chart. They were brothers, boys from Ohio, Texas, and New York, each one waiting for someone to keep them alive another hour. The siege had now dragged on for over a week. The snow outside was waist deep, and the temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The Germans encircled the town completely. Every attempt to drop supplies from the air had failed. The weather was too brutal, the visibility too poor. C-47s circled helplessly above the clouds, their precious cargo of plasma and bandages unable to reach the ground. On the battlefield, wounded men froze to death before they could be carried in. Inside, the wounded burned with fever, infection, and shock. The medics moved constantly, their hands raw and cracked from cold water and blood. Among them was a young medic whose name would never appear in headlines, but whose actions would outlive his anonymity. He was not an officer, not a doctor, but a field medic trained in emergency first aid. Before the war, he had worked in a hospital laboratory, learning the basics of chemistry and anatomy. That background, buried under months of combat, suddenly resurfaced. When the last plasma bottle was gone, he stood before the wounded and refused to accept that there was nothing left to try. He understood that blood plasma's purpose was not to replace blood, but to restore volume and maintain pressure, to keep oxygen flowing long enough for the body to recover. What if that effect could be imitated? The human body, he remembered, relied on a delicate balance of electrolytes, sodium, potassium, glucose, to keep cells functioning. Perhaps if he could replicate that balance even crudely, he might sustain life. It would not heal the wound, but it could prevent death from shock. In the corner of the basement, he found an old metal pan, a few sealed ampules of distilled water, and a bag of table salt meant for food. He remembered an emergency formula he had once read about: saline mixed to a precise ratio, enough to mimic the osmotic pressure of human plasma. With trembling hands, he began measuring the ingredients. For energy, he added sugar from a ration tin. The mixture was crude, untested, and dangerous. Contamination could kill faster than bleeding. But with sterilization impossible and time running out, there was no other option. Every sound from above reminded him how little time he had. The artillery never stopped. Each explosion shook dust from the ceiling onto the wounded below. A medic nearby was wrapping a stump where a leg had been, Another was wiping frost from a soldier's face. They worked in silence. Every movement mechanical, every decision a calculation bet, between survival and despair. The young medic filled a glass bottle with his makeshift solution and held it to the candlelight. It was clear, colorless, ordinary looking. Yet in that moment, it felt like a miracle in his hands. He tested it first on a man who was nearly gone, a paratrooper whose pulse was thin and fading. He cleaned the man's arm with the last of their alcohol, inserted a needle, and slowly let the liquid flow. The others watched, saying nothing. Minutes passed. The candle flickered. Then the soldier's color changed slightly. His breathing steadied. It wasn't recovery, but it was life. Something they had not seen for hours. Word spread quickly among the medics. They began to repeat the method, using whatever containers they could find, canteens, flasks, even empty plasma bottles. The solution was simple enough to mix, and though it was far from perfect, it worked. Men who should have died were still breathing. For the first time in days, the medics allowed themselves to believe they might hold out until the skies cleared. The young medic kept refining the formula, adjusting the balance of salt and sugar, heating the mixture over candle flames to keep it sterile. He wrote notes on scraps of paper, recording each variation, each patient's response. It was science born from desperation, carried out under bombardment, guided only by reason and instinct. By Christmas Eve, the basement smelled of smoke and boiling water. The moans of the wounded mixed with the distant rumble of tanks. Outside, the snow kept falling, muffling the sound of war. Inside, a fragile rhythm had returned, the steady drip of the improvised infusion. The medic knew he was crossing a line that no manual allowed, but he also knew that without this, there would be no one left to save. With no plasma left and hundreds still bleeding, he reached for what science forbade, and what hope demanded. In that underground world of flickering light and whispered prayers, war stripped every man to his core. The medic's invention was not born of brilliance but of necessity, the kind that leaves no space for hesitation. His hands were cracked from the cold, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights, yet his focus never wavered. He worked on instinct, feeling the pulse of each patient, judging survival not by charts or instruments, but by breath and color. This was the human angle of the Ardennes. Not strategy or glory, but the fight for one heartbeat at a time. The wounded who lay before him were soldiers of every kind. Some had faces burned by explosions. Others clutched photographs of families already fading from the paper. Frostbite turned fingers black. A man might survive a mortar shell only to die from infection a week later. The medic moved among them like a ghost, his boots crunching on frozen debris, whispering short words of reassurance he barely believed himself. Yet even in that hell, moments of humanity glimmered. One soldier, half conscious, reached up and gripped his wrist, murmuring a single word. "Thanks." It was enough to keep the medic going. Every drop of that homemade solution became an act of defiance against despair. It wasn't perfect medicine. It wasn't even approved medicine. But in Bastogne, perfection no longer existed. The medic wasn't treating so, Bulge. He was buying time, stealing life back from death one bottle at a time. In the bitter cold, his work became a ritual. Heat the water, dissolve the salt, stir the sugar, and pray it would hold. Yet beneath the emotional struggle lay something deeper, the medical angle, where innovation met desperation. Before the war, doctors had studied substitutes for plasma. Some scientists had experimented with saline glucose mixtures, but they were unreliable, prone to contamination, and quickly discarded in favor of true plasma. In normal hospitals, such improvisation would be unthinkable. But the field hospitals of Bastogne were not normal. There were no laboratories, no sterilizers, no microscopes. The only instruments were steel needles, battered pans, and the steady will of men determined not to give up. The science behind it was simple but fragile. The human bloodstream required osmotic balance to prevent cells from bursting or shrinking. Too much salt, and dehydration would set in. Too little, and the blood vessels would leak fluid into the tissues. Glucose provided quick energy to organs starved of oxygen, helping sustain life when real blood was gone. It was a stopgap measure, a chemical illusion of normalcy in a body already breaking down. But somehow, it worked. Word of the success spread quietly from one medic to another. Soon, across different aid stations in Bastogne, men began experimenting in similar ways. The idea took root like a whispered secret. Each variation was slightly different. Some mixed in powdered glucose from ration packs. Others added a pinch more salt or warmed the solution over a fire to sterilize it. They wrote nothing down officially, fearing reprimand if word ever reached the higher command. But among those who watched men rise from near death, no one questioned it. This small miracle became the thin thread holding their morale together. Yet the battlefield angle was no less brutal. The German siege never loosened. Every attempt to break through the lines ended in heavy losses. Paratroopers fought from foxholes dug into frozen mud, their rifles freezing in their hands. The nights were endless. The snow reflected the flashes of artillery in eerie silence. Inside Bastogne, there was no clear front line. The town was a cratered ruin, burning trucks, shattered houses, horses lying stiff in the snow. Medical outposts shifted constantly as shells destroyed one building after another. Each move meant carrying the wounded through streets swept by sniper fire. Many medics never returned from those trips. They went out with stretchers and vanished into the blizzard. For the medic and his comrades, exhaustion became a constant companion. They lived on black coffee, canned rations, and adrenaline. The cold gnawed through their coats. Infections spread faster than they could treat it. At times, they had to choose who to save and who to let go, a decision that left scars deeper than any wound. Still, they kept faith in the method. The makeshift blood substitute, mixed and administered by trembling hands, became their quiet rebellion against the cruelty of war. Each soldier who survived seemed to justify the risk. They began to keep track. How many lived? How long they lasted? What symptoms appeared? The numbers were crude, scrawled on bits of paper, but they told a story science would later confirm. The improvised solution, though imperfect, was keeping men alive. It was a victory not of medicine, but of courage. The field hospitals became symbols of resilience amid the storm. There were no headlines, no speeches, just the rhythmic sound of dripping fluid in bottles and the faint heartbeat of soldiers refusing to die. By the end of December, the siege had turned Bastogne into a graveyard of burned vehicles and broken trees. Yet beneath the frozen ruins, life continued to flicker. The medic's formula, passed quietly from one pair of hands to another, had begun to change everything. The crisis, however, was far from over. Supplies still hadn't arrived. The weather was worsening. The Germans were tightening their noose. For every man saved, 2 more came through the door bleeding. There were moments when the medic doubted his work, wondering if it was truly saving lives or merely delaying death. But each time he hesitated, he looked at the pale faces before him and returned to mixing another batch. The snow outside thickened again. The roads were gone. The air smelled of fuel and smoke. Inside the cellar, the candlelight trembled, and the medic's reflection flickered in the metal pan as he stirred the next mixture. Somewhere deep inside, he knew this act, this defiance of protocol, this fragile hope, was becoming more than an experiment. It was survival itself. The line between science and faith was beginning to blur. Beyond the frozen walls of Bastogne, the world had no idea what was happening inside that besieged pocket. Newspapers in London and New York printed cautious headlines. Bastogne surrounded, but no one could imagine the scale of isolation. To the men trapped there, Time dissolved into one long, sleepless night. The war had reduced everything to essentials: food, warmth, and the thin thread of hope that help might come. Yet even in the darkness, the medics' improvised invention gave them something they hadn't felt for days: a sense of control. But the siege was tightening. The tactical angle of Bastogne's encirclement made survival almost impossible. The Germans had cut every road, positioned artillery on surrounding hills, and watched every clearing for movement. Airdrops were the only hope, but the weather conspired against them. For nearly a week, Allied aircraft couldn't break through the thick cloud cover. Inside the town, soldiers dug deeper into frozen basements, rationing food and ammunition. Every building became a fortress. Medical posts were often just cellars with stretchers laid out on bare stone. The medics' challenge wasn't just treating the wounded. It was keeping the hospital itself alive. Coal was gone, so fires were made from broken furniture. Water had to be melted from snow. Every ampule, every drop of alcohol, every bit of gauze was precious. The saline mixtures had to be boiled with candle heat, filtered through torn cloth and poured carefully into bottles scavenged from the rubble. The simplest mistake, a dirty needle, an air bubble, could mean death. But he persisted, repeating the same ritual each day, each night. Commanders understood little of what happened in those basements. They saw the number of wounded grow, but their focus was elsewhere, holding the perimeter, keeping the lines from collapsing. In that sense, the medic and his comrades fought their own silent battle. One fought not with rifles, but with bandages and boiling water. Their war had no front line, yet its outcome was just as decisive. Every man saved was another soldier who might fight again if rescue came. Meanwhile, leadership was being tested on every level. The leadership angle in Bastogne was defined by endurance rather than command. General McAuliffe's calm defiance after rejecting the German demand for surrender gave the troops something to hold on to. But his officers knew the truth. Morale was fragile, and the wounded far outnumbered their capacity to care for them. The medics were unsung heroes, operating beyond orders, improvising in conditions no regulation had foreseen. When word began circulating of a miracle mixture that seemed to keep men alive, some officers dismissed it as rumor. Others quietly encouraged it. In that siege, there was no room for doctrine, only what worked. The medic's method soon reached other aid stations through whispered instruction and hastily scribbled notes. Men who'd once doubted began to try it themselves, measuring salt and sugar by feel rather than scale. In those moments, authority blurred. The chain of command yielded to the chain of survival. Every soldier understood. Orders mattered, but saving lives mattered more. As days turned to nights and back again, the moral weight of the work began to sink in. The moral angle of Bastogne was a quiet agony. The medic knew he was walking a razor's edge, experimenting on human lives without permission, using untested solutions whose side effects were unknown. It was a decision born of desperation, not defiance. Yet it haunted him. What if his mixture caused harm later? What if it gave false hope? There was no way to know. But there was also no alternative. When faced with a man bleeding out on the floor, the question wasn't, is it safe? But, can I keep him alive until morning? Every medic in that cellar faced the same dilemma. Some hesitated, unwilling to cross that invisible line. Others followed his lead, trusting his results more than their fear. They didn't call it science. They called it survival. In the chaos of war, ethics were not abandoned. They were redefined. The act of doing something, anything, became an act of mercy. Outside, the snow never stopped. The forest around Bastogne became a graveyard of burned-out tanks. German soldiers froze in foxholes only a few hundred meters away, suffering the same cold, the same hunger. The front lines were so close that their cries could sometimes be heard at night. The medic treated German prisoners when they came in, giving them the same improvised mixture he used for Americans. In that frozen cellar, uniforms ceased to matter. Pain spoke only one language. By the last week of December, the homemade blood substitute had become a quiet revolution. It wasn't written in any medical report or authorized by any headquarters, yet it was saving lives across the encircled town. The men who received it often didn't even know. They only felt a sudden surge of strength, a faint warmth returning to their fingers. The medics began to believe that they might survive the siege after all. But the victory was fragile. The Germans launched renewed assaults, determined to crush Bastogne before Patton's forces could arrive. Shells landed closer each day, collapsing parts of the hospital. Dust filled the air. One night, the building next door took a direct hit. The blast blew out the candles, and for several minutes the medics worked in total darkness, guided only by touch. When the lights returned, the young medic stood over a soldier who'd survived because of his mixture, and realized that his idea, once an act of desperation, had become the only thing standing between hope and oblivion. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a man doing what he must, knowing full well that when the war ended, no one might ever know what he had done. But in that moment, as another bottle drained into another arm, the truth was clear. Survival in Bastogne wasn't just about bullets and bravery. It was about one man's refusal to let science end where humanity began. The line between healing and harm had never been thinner, and the snow kept falling. The final week of December 1944 pressed down on Bastogne with the weight of inevitability. The town had become a frozen island in a sea of fire. Artillery shells fell in endless rhythm, shaking the earth, lighting up the snow with orange flashes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The sky remained a solid wall of gray. No planes, no sun, no hope of relief. Inside the shattered basements that served as hospitals, the air was heavy with smoke and fear. Men whispered prayers into the cold, while medics moved between them with hollow eyes. The war outside had turned into an echo of the war inside, slow, grinding, merciless. In one basement, the young medic stood before a table littered with bottles, pans, and folded scraps of paper stained with notes. The last candle burned low. His breath hung in the air like mist. Around him lay men on stretchers, some conscious, some far beyond pain. The silence between artillery blasts was worse than the explosions themselves. It carried the sound of labored breathing, of boots scraping stone, of whispered goodbyes. He had grown used to that sound. But tonight, something felt different. The air itself seemed to demand a choice. A soldier had just been brought in, his chest torn open by shrapnel. His pulse was faint, his skin gray. The medic knelt beside him, fingers searching for any sign of warmth. The plasma stores were gone. Even the improvised mixtures were running out. There was no time to wait for rescue, no way to move the man elsewhere. In the flickering light, he made his decision. He reached for his last bottle of water, poured it into a dented pan, and added a measured spoonful of salt from a ration pack. Then, from his pocket, he pulled a lump of hardened sugar, scraped from a mess tin earlier that day, and crushed it between his fingers. The crystals fell into the liquid like snow. He stirred it with a sterilized knife, sparing the ratios he had memorized days before. There were no instruments, no measurements beyond memory and instinct. This was medicine at its most primitive, and yet it carried the weight of every lesson he had ever learned. He set the bottle near the candle to warm. The heat barely touched it, but it was enough to keep it from freezing. As he prepared the needle, he could feel his hands trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He had gone nearly 40 hours without sleep. The room around him blurred. He blinked hard, steadying himself. Then he inserted the needle into the soldier's arm and let the clear liquid begin to flow. For a moment, nothing happened. The man's pulse fluttered and slowed. Another medic watched silently, his face expressionless. Minutes passed. The candle hissed and went out, leaving only the faint glow of a lantern across the room. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the soldier's breathing began to deepen. His lips regained a hint of color. The medic felt for a pulse. It was weak, but steady. Against all odds, the man was stabilizing. He didn't allow himself relief. He simply moved on to the next stretcher. Another man, another mixture, another gamble. The night became a blur of motion. Heat, stir, inject, repeat. Each time he feared the moment when it might fail, when a body would not respond. But each time, against logic, life returned. The formula was working. Word spread through the other medics like a quiet spark in the dark. Soon, others were helping him, copying his technique, learning the mixture by heart. Some had no sugar left and used glucose tablets instead. Others found ways to warm the fluid over lanterns. They filled reused bottles, marking each one with a piece of tape and a crude letter S for saline. Above ground, the Germans launched new attacks. Their tanks pressed closer, artillery thundering. Buildings collapsed, and snow turned gray with soot. But inside those basements, something unseen was happening. For every life lost, another was being pulled back from the edge. The medics worked without pause, deaf to the shellfire above. The rhythm of the battlefield had become the rhythm of the drip, slow, steady, defiant. One night, as the bombs fell closer than ever, the young medic sat on a crate, his hands raw and swollen. Around him, the wounded slept or murmured in delirium. The air was filled with the faint sound of heartbeats and the slow hiss of air escaping from glass bottles. He knew that what he had done might be condemned later, that it broke every rule of wartime medicine. But in that moment, surrounded by men who were still breathing because of him, he felt no guilt, only the quiet satisfaction of having refused to surrender. Outside, the storm of war reached its peak. German tanks stood just beyond the edge of town, their engines rumbling in the darkness. Yet even as shells landed closer, even as walls cracked and ceilings fell, the medic kept working. His hands moved by instinct, his mind locked on one thought: keep them alive until morning. Morning came gray and bitterly cold. The siege had lasted nearly 10 days. Supplies were gone, rations nearly empty. But something was changing. Through the thick clouds above Bastogne, faint sounds began to echo. Distant engines, growing louder. At first the medics thought it was imagination, but then someone shouted, "Planes!" The men stumbled outside, blinking into the pale light. Far above, tiny specks broke through the clouds. C-47 transport planes, their bellies opening to release parachutes heavy with crates. The airdrops had finally come. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, all falling from the sky like salvation. For the first time in weeks, the men of Bastogne looked up and felt something close to relief. Inside the cellar, the medic sat back and let out a long breath. The bottles around him glimmered faintly in the light filtering through the cracks above. He didn't know if the supplies would arrive in time to save everyone, but he knew this: his invention had bought them the time to be saved. And as the sound of engines faded, he allowed himself to close his eyes, if only for a moment. Would you like me to continue with Climax Turning Point, Part 2, approx 850 words, next? You said, yes, ChatGPT said. Section 4, Climax, Turning Point, Part 2, 850 words. The morning of December 26th dawned pale and brittle, the kind of cold that burned through cloth and bone alike. Bastogne was barely standing. Smoke drifted lazily over broken rooftops, and the streets were lined with shattered vehicles, frozen corpses, and silence. But beneath that silence, in the hospital cellars, life was clinging on, thin, fragile, but defiant. The medic rose from his cot after barely an hour of sleep. His face was hollow, eyes sunken, fingers cracked from the cold and disinfectant. Around him, men still breathed who would have been dead days ago. Some sat upright now, sipping weak broth. Others lay unconscious but stable. It was the first time in weeks that the word stable meant something real. He moved from one patient to another, checking pulses, adjusting bandages, whispering instructions to the other medics. Outside, the rumble of artillery still echoed, but something about it felt different now. More distant, less suffocating. And then came the sound that froze everyone in place. The low, rhythmic growl of engines. American engines. Down the road from Bastogne, Sherman tanks of General Patton's Third Army were pushing through the snow, their treads grinding ice and rubble into mud. They had marched nearly 100 miles in freezing weather, battling snowdrifts and German ambushes to reach this town. Inside Bastogne, the defenders didn't yet know it, but the tide of the battle was about to turn. At noon, the first tank rolled through the southern perimeter. Soldiers emerged from basements and foxholes, their faces smeared with soot and disbelief. Relief had come. The siege was over. Men laughed and cried at the same time, hugging one another amid the ruins. The medic didn't celebrate. Not yet. He was still bent over a patient whose breathing had just stopped. With a cal and precision born from exhaustion, he began another transfusion, whispering, "Not yet, not now." The battle outside would become a legend. The nuts reply of General McAuliffe, the stubborn defense of the 101st Airborne, the arrival of Patton's army in what military historians would later call a logistical miracle. But in that cold basement, another kind of victory was unfolding, quiet, unseen, yet equally miraculous. The medic's homemade solution, born out of desperation and defiance, had saved dozens of lives in those critical days. It wasn't a cure, it wasn't even fully safe, but it had worked when nothing else could. Over the next 48 hours, the air over Bastogne was filled with the constant drone of C-47s. Medical supplies dropped in parachute bundles, food and ammunition followed. The medics tore into the new plasma kits and compared them with their crude substitutes. The difference was staggering, but by then it didn't matter. The worst had passed. Reporters and officers began moving through the hospital areas, taking notes and photographs. They recorded the state of the wounded, the conditions of the siege, the endurance of the medical teams. When they asked how so many had survived without plasma, some of the medics hesitated. They pointed to the young man who had led the improvisation, but he shrugged off the attention. "We did what we had to," he said simply. "They were dying, so we gave them something to live on." He didn't know whether his concoction would hold up under scrutiny, whether it would be called innovation or recklessness. But his results were undeniable. The wounded soldiers he treated lived to tell their stories. Many of them credited him directly for keeping them alive through the siege. Word of his method spread beyond Bastogne. Other medical units began experimenting with saline and glucose mixtures when plasma ran short. Eventually, medical researchers confirmed what he had discovered in the field, that under certain conditions, such simple solutions could temporarily maintain circulation and buy time until real plasma arrived. By the end of December, Bastogne was secure. The German offensive had lost its momentum. Patton's counterattack pushed the enemy back into the woods they had come from. Snow covered the wreckage of tanks and bodies alike, sealing them into the white silence once more. For the survivors, the nightmare was ending. In the days that followed, the medic was finally ordered to rest. He stepped outside the cellar into daylight for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. The air was sharp, clean, almost unreal. Around him, the town was rubble, but alive. He could hear laughter, the clatter of mess tins, the bark of a sergeant counting rations. Life was returning, slowly, painfully. He sat on the steps of a broken church, holding his gloves in his lap. The snowflakes melted on his skin, leaving tiny drops of water that glistened in the pale light. He thought of the faces he couldn't save, men who had died before he dared to try something different. But he also thou, 8 of the dozen still breathing below ground, each heartbeat a small defiance of the cold and the war. That night, as he prepared to sleep for the first time without fear of shelling, he opened his notebook. Its pages were torn, smudged, and stained with blood and ink. On one page he wrote down the formula he had discovered, carefully noting the ratios, the temperature, and the warning. Temporary use only, when nothing else is left. He didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but he wanted it written down, not as proof, not for glory, but for memory. Outside, the snow began to fall again. The town slept. The guns were silent. The medic closed his eyes, knowing that his work, born of desperation in the depths of the Ardennes, had given others the chance to see another sunrise. He could never have known that decades later, his field improvisation would become a recognized precursor to the modern saline 4. A testament not just to medical science, but to the human will to save life when all else fails. And as dawn crept over Bastogne once more, the smoke rose straight into the cold, clear sky. The first peaceful morning in weeks. When the siege of Bastogne finally lifted, the town resembled a landscape out of another world. Every building bore scars of war, shattered roofs, frozen wells, walls cratered by shells. The roads were littered with burned-out tanks and splintered trees. The few civilians who had not fled wandered among the ruins, their faces blank with exhaustion. Snow still fell, muffling the sound of men rebuilding fires, burying their dead, and searching for anything that could be saved. For the medical teams, there was no time to rest. The wounded kept coming. Men who had crawled out from the forests, frostbitten soldiers rescued from foxholes, and those brought in from nearby villages. The medic who had created the improvised blood substitute found himself once again at the center of quiet chaos. This time, though, he wasn't improvising to survive. He was documenting everything. What worked, what didn't, how long each patient had lasted on the mixture before proper transfusions arrived. Within days, reports began circulating through the command structure. Army medical officers who visited Bastogne were stunned by the survival rates. Many of the men who should have died from shock or blood loss had somehow held on. The numbers didn't make sense until they heard about the homemade solution. Some dismissed it as luck, others as an exaggeration born of adrenaline and stress. But those who had seen it with their own eyes knew better. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when necessity had forced medicine forward. By early January 1945, when Patton's forces fully secured the region, Bastogne had become a symbol not just of resistance, but of endurance. The world learned about the soldiers who had held out against overwhelming odds, the generals who had refused to surrender, and the dramatic rescue through snow and steel. Yet behind those headlines lay another, quiet, simple saline solutions. Something long debated but rarely trusted in combat, gained new credibility. Researchers later traced the success of modern IV fluids back to those desperate winter nights in the Ardennes, when one medic refused to let his patients die waiting for plasma that would never come. When the medic was finally ordered away from Bastogne, he packed only his field notes and a single empty bottle, the first one he had filled with his improvised mixture. It was cracked from the cold, but he carried it like a relic. As he climbed into the back of a supply truck, the snow began to fall again. He looked once more at the town that had nearly vanished beneath the war, and for the first time since it began, he allowed himself a small smile. The battle was over. But its legacy, and his quiet experiment, was only beginning to unfold. In the months that followed Bastogne's relief, the snow melted, revealing the full cost of the battle. The fields that had once been white were now churned mud, dotted with helmets and shell casings. The war pushed onward, through the forests of the Rhineland, across the Rhine, and into Germany itself. But for those who had fought and bled in the Ardennes, something inside them had changed forever. The memory of that siege, the hunger, the cold, and the desperate struggle for survival would never fade. For the medic, life did not slow down. He was reassigned to another field unit as the Allied advance continued east. This time, however, his kit contained something new: sterile saline bags and glucose solutions, mass-produced and standardized based on the formula he had improvised under siege. The army had quietly adopted versions of his method, refined and tested in laboratories. What had begun as a desperate act in the basements of Bastogne was now being formalized into doctrine. It was no longer seen as improvisation, but as in Bastogne itself, the hospitals were cleared out and rebuilt. The Belgian civilians who had endured the siege alongside the American troops began returning to their homes. Many remembered the medics who had saved their sons, husbands, or neighbors. Years later, when monuments were raised to the soldiers of the 101st Airborne, small plaques also appeared in honor of the Medical Corps, the men who fought their war with bandages instead of rifles. When the war ended in May 1945, Europe erupted in celebration. Church bells rang, crowds flooded the streets of Paris, London, and Brussels. But for those who had worked in the field hospitals, the end felt quieter. There were no parades for them, no grand speeches, just relief and an overwhelming fatigue that words couldn't describe. The medic was among those quietly demobilized and sent home. He returned to a world that had moved on without him. The routines of civilian life felt strange after the chaos of war, but he carried with him the habits of Bastogne, cleanliness, precision, and an unshakable respect for the fragility of life. He enrolled in medical school under the GI Bill, driven not by ambition, but by memory. Every lesson, every lecture, every patient reminded him of those winter nights when the line between life and death had been measured in drops of water and salt. In later years, his wartime notebooks were rediscovered and studied by researchers examining the evolution of battlefield medicine. His notes, written in smudged pencil and blood-stained pages, became an invaluable record of field innovation. One medical historian wrote that his mixture embodied the purest form of medical ethics, to preserve life when all else is lost. The medic himself rarely spoke of what he had done. When asked, he would only say, "We didn't have a choice." Yet his actions had reshaped emergency medicine, the modern IV saline. What he created was never meant to be revolutionary. It was simply survival, a desperate act born from compassion. Yet in that act, the boundaries between science and humanity blurred. His solution was crude, uncertain, and unauthorized, but it carried something greater than any laboratory formula: faith that a life, once given a chance, might cling on long enough for rescue to come. In the decades that followed, medicine advanced in leaps: antibiotics, portable transfusions, and the standardized saline I-4 now used across the world. Few remember where its wartime validation began, but every hospital drip, every clear bag that sustains a patient's heartbeat, carries within it a thread that leads back to that frozen town in the Ardennes, to the moment a man knelt beside a dying soldier and chose to act when others would have stopped. War often glorifies destruction, tanks, bombs, and the men who wield them. But Bastogne reminds us that not all heroes carry rifles. Some carry scalpels, bandages, and the unyielding belief that saving one life is worth any risk. In the stillness after the guns fell silent, the medic's story faded into history, a footnote in reports, a whisper among survivors. Yet his legacy endures every time a doctor reaches for an IV line, every time a medic improvises in the field, every time compassion triumphs over fear. The Battle of the Bulge was won by courage in the trenches. But within Bastogne, another kind of victory was achieved, one measured not in territory or medals, but in heartbeats restored, breaths regained, and lives reclaimed from the edge of death. And in that victory, perhaps, lies the truest face of humanity amid war.